In this video, I'm going to tell you about scatter terrain and explain what it is and why you might want some. So we're all familiar with terrain. We know about hills and castles and ruins and buildings and fortifications and all the normal stuff that you have on your gaming board. If you don't know about terrain, I've made a video about it years ago, Pachow, and you should probably check it out because terrain really brings a visual interest to your wargaming, and it really helps to not only just bring in the immersion, but it also gives you something for your models to hide behind. It breaks up line of sight. Sometimes it's an objective. You need to destroy this building, or you need to take over this shrine, or whatever. Having terrain on the board is kind of quintessential, obviously, to tabletop wargaming. However, a board that is just 5 or 6 big chunks of terrain and nothing else still looks a little barren. You still, in my opinion, to really help bring in the immersion and to really make the visual kind of look nice, you need to have more than just the big units of terrain. You need to have something that a lot of people will refer to as scatter terrain. And sometimes that scatter terrain is just visual. It's just to make things look nicer, and it has no in-game kind of effect. And then there's other types of scatter terrain, which are things that your models, especially if you're playing a skirmish game, can actually, hide behind or be impeded by, like if they're trying to move, or if it's a vehicle and maybe it's some sort of, tank trap or something like that. So what do some people refer to as scatter terrain? Well, some people refer to little pieces of gravel, little pieces of moss, lichen, I can still never pronounce that word properly. These little pieces of stuff that are supposed to look like bushes and rocks and all that kind of stuff will make things look just a little bit more interesting. Some people like to, and I see this a lot in battle reports, people will kind of sprinkle, sort of like they've got a piece of terrain and they'll sprinkle rocks and little pieces of gravel and tiny little pieces of stuff around the edges of that terrain to sort of help kind of move it into the, kind of gradually sort of blend it into the normal game board, the mat you might be using, or you might be using a 3-dimensional, actual board. And that's fine. I always look at that kind of terrain, that extra little bit. It's visually interesting, but in my mind, when I'm watching those battle reports, I'm always thinking to myself, well, someone's going to have to clean all that up afterwards. So I don't generally use little pieces of rock and stuff like that. Sometimes little pieces of moss and things I've used in the past, but normally I stick it like to bases on my normal terrain. I don't just sprinkle it about. But some people refer to that as scatter terrain as well. And almost always, it doesn't have any actual meaning in the game. It doesn't give you a bonus or a negative. It doesn't slow you down or speed you. There's no cover, that kind of stuff generally. Depends on your gaming group and how you guys like to play, and that's really the big benefit to wargaming, is that house rules, and you guys can do pretty much what you want. When I'm talking about scatter terrain, though, what I'm talking about are just smaller pieces of terrain that give a visual sort of excitement to the board. They add a little bit more to the board, and it doesn't look so sparse. But frequently they're also something that, especially in some sort of skirmish game, that a single figure could kind of hide behind. Maybe it's a couple of metal barrels that are up against the side of a building, and when that model is behind that, now they can kind of get some cover, depending on the game system. Maybe it's sandbags. Maybe it's all kinds of different things like that. And finding those pieces is not as difficult as it used to be. Number one, there's tons of companies now that are producing that kind of stuff. Some of them are producing it in resin, some of them are producing it in plastic. These little pieces I picked up at Adepticon are from the Miniature Market website, and they do lots of different stuff like this, where it's columns, little, what is this? This is like a crate, computer screens, jersey barriers, that kind of stuff. They had at Adepticon, they had this huge kind of, just huge group of buckets, basically, and you could dig through and buy as many as you want, and they had a certain price and everything. And it was cool little stuff that you're going to probably paint, put on your board, and really add to sort of what's going on with your game system. And like I said, there's sci-fi stuff, there's fantasy stuff, there's modern stuff, all these different types of things. And there's a lot of companies that are creating this stuff, predominantly in resin and that kind of stuff. But other companies are starting to do it in plastic as well. Mantic Games has started making these terrain crates, and they're making stuff for sci-fi. They're even showing here, you'll see some stuff for fantasy. These things are prototypes, which I don't believe are out yet, but they sent me some stuff. But you've got bookshelves, you've got fantasy tables and benches and things like that, depending on what kind of game you're playing. But there's all kinds of things as well, cars. You can make your own stuff, obviously, as well, come up with all kinds of different things. I used to save the bottle caps from like 20-ounce sodas and then glue them end to end, and then you get like a weird, once you've painted it and all that kind of stuff, you get this sort of interesting kind of sci-fi, almost like a barrel, but it doesn't look like a normal oil barrel, 55-gallon drum sort of thing. All these different types of things are things that will help to spruce up your board, but they'll also really help to put a little bit more tactical enjoyment into the game, because you're not just like, well, I either have to hide behind this building or I don't. You can say, well, I'm going to run from the corner of this building where there's this barrel where I can get a shot off, and then in my next turn, if I run over here to this wooden fence, well, maybe I'll be able to still have cover, but it's soft cover instead of hard cover. Different games have different kinds of cover systems. Some games are just like, it's either cover or it's not, and then there are other games where they're talking about the type of cover, soft cover, hard cover, all kinds of different things. And being able to kind of variate, that's not a word, being able to make variations of the different types of terrain that you'd like to be able to put on your board really helps to, I think, really expand what you can do. Sometimes you don't want to be working on a big piece of terrain. I've talked in the past about how if you're having a hard time painting figures, maybe switch over to try some terrain, work on your terrain. Maybe you don't want to work on a big piece of terrain because it seems daunting and it seems like a lot of work. Maybe you want to work on something small. So you're going to take some of these types of little tiny pieces and you're going to start, you're going to prime them up real quick and paint them and go that direction. Or maybe you're going to start creating stuff from scratch. You're going to use the little bottle cap things that I talked about, or any other kind of product that you look at and go, that could be a sci-fi crate, or that could be whatever. You could sculpt little pieces if you wanted to make even just like little bits of rocks. These are little kind of like stumps. These are just little things that if you had vehicles in a game, maybe these stumps would make it so the vehicles couldn't pass. Almost like, dragon's teeth or things like that you see in like maybe World War II games. Or these could just be something difficult for your units to get across. Could be something that they could hide in, or at least get some soft cover, something like that. All kinds of different little things can really help your overall table look nicer, have more tactical interest, and you have to think about more than just like, I'll plop down these 4 buildings and we'll play a game. Especially in skirmish games, you want to think about where are little places that single figures can hide, and things like this type of scatter terrain as opposed to the gravel and the moss. This stuff can really help keep your guys alive and just enjoy the game a little bit more for you and your friends.